Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to some articles from this magazine, National Geographic History. First of all, I just want to say thank you for your very kind words while I took a little break. I've been feeling a little under the weather, nothing too severe, just my typical chronic issues. So I picked up this magazine and posted on my Instagram the table of contents and asked you guys what I should read. And I took your advice and I wound up just reading the whole magazine front to back and loved all of it. So I'm just going to read all of the main articles to you. I learned something neat in every single one, and I want to share them all with you. So let's just dive right in. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to read to you these main articles. They are When Sheba Met Solomon, The Plague of Athens, An Army for the Afterlife, The Rise of Roman Chariot Racing, and The Queen's Favorite Sea Dog. I'm going to skip the smaller ones, so if you want to learn about these topics, you can check out the magazine yourself. I'm also going to skip all the little boxes and side notes in these articles. But these were all really interesting too. This one's about Rabban Bar Salma, who was like it says right here, Marco Polo in reverse. This one's about the Tulsa massacre that happened 100 years ago. This one breaks down a work of art that depicts Napoleon's death. This is about Queen Victoria's wedding cake, which started the whole wedding cake trend that we have. And this one was really neat. It's about a statue that was discovered underground in the 1500s and sort of revolutionized the whole Renaissance sculpture art scene. It's really cool. But we're just going to read these today. Let's see. Oh, this one is about China, and I've really been working on my Chinese pronunciation. I think I've got it right. It's about Qinshi Huangdi. But feel free to correct me, because that's one of my goals for this year, is to learn how to correctly pronounce Chinese things. So let's dive right in with Solomon and the Queen. Look at this cool painting. The story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba appears in the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles. An unnamed queen from Sheba travels to Jerusalem bearing gold, jewels, and spices. A seeker of knowledge, the queen has a special interest in the reputedly wise Solomon and tests him with some hard questions. Solomon meets the challenge and lavishes hospitality on the queen, who reciprocates with gifts. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. Later she tells him, in wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. This biblical encounter has had an enormous impact on the popular imagination, projecting themes of beauty, wealth, power, exoticism, intrigue, magic, and love. The Queen has inspired Turkish and Persian miniatures, European painting and music, and the 1959 Hollywood epic Solomon and Sheba, with Yul Brynner as the wise king and Gina Lollobrigida as his match. These works had plenty of material to work with, since a rich literary tradition grew out of the original biblical story. An account of the encounter is tantalizingly referenced by the Roman Jewish author Flavius Josephus in the 1st century CE. Composed in the 7th century, the Quran features a more elaborate version of the story, as does Jewish rabbinic literature. The Kebra Nagast, a 14th century Ethiopian Christian epic, connects the Queen of Sheba with the founding of Ethiopia itself. According to this text, ancient Sheba is in Ethiopia. The queen and Solomon have a son who founds a dynasty that would rule Ethiopia until its last descendant, Haile Selassie, died in 1975. I'm sure I said that wrong. Apologies. To date, no archaeological evidence has been found to indicate definitely who the queen was and from where she came. She could be a composite of historical figures or entirely legendary. Even the location of Sheba itself is hotly debated among scholars. Some place it in Ethiopia, while others place it in the ancient kingdom of Saba, in present-day Yemen. Riches and riddles. In the Bible, the Queen of Sheba is depicted as smart, independent, challenging, and respectful. Flavius Josephus, author of the 1st century CE history, The Antiquities of the Jews, described Sheba as inquisitive into philosophy and on other accounts also was to be admired. By the time the story was retold in the Targum Sheni, a 7th to 8th century CE Jewish text, the story had amassed more details. The details of the meeting are similar, but the story begins with a talking hoopoe, a crested bird native to the region. The bird informs Solomon that the land of Sheba is the only one on earth not subject to his power. Solomon sends the hoopoe to Sheba with a letter urging the queen to submit to him. She responds by sending back a fleet with all the ships of the sea, loaded with precious gifts, including 6,000 young men, all the same height, all dressed in purple, and all born at the same time on the same day. They deliver a message from the queen announcing that she will travel to Jerusalem. On arrival, the queen presents Solomon with 3 riddles, which he promptly solves. This exchange reveals her knowledge and diplomatic skill, as the riddles are more than a game to her. They are a way for her to size up Solomon. Some scholars argue the Quran's version of the story borrows from the Targum Sheni. However, there is historical uncertainty as to exactly when the Targum Sheni was written. It may, in fact, post-date the 7th century composition of the Quran, in which case the Islamic text could have influenced the Jewish text, and not the other way around. In the Quran, the queen is unnamed, but contemporary Arabic sources call her Bilqis. Bilqis? Let's say Bilqis, I like that. In the Islamic version, Suleiman believes in Allah, is known for his wisdom, and can understand the language of the trees and animals. Suleiman also controls an army of jinn, which are magical spirits, and men and birds. Like the Jewish text, the story begins with a bird, which brings news to Suleiman from the far-off land of Sheba, where the powerful Bilqis rules, and people worship the sun. The bird says, "I found her and her people prostrating to the sun instead of Allah," prompting Suleiman to send a letter in which he urges the queen to convert to Islam. In this version of the story, Suleiman rejects the queen's emissaries and rich gifts. In contrast to the Bible and the Targum Sheni, it is Suleiman who tests the queen's intellect. While she is traveling to visit him, the king sends a jinn to steal her throne and bring it to Jerusalem. There he disguises the throne in order to see if the queen will realize it is hers. She does, so Suleiman welcomes her to his impressive palace. Suleiman shows the queen a floor made of glass. When she sees it, she thinks it is a pool of water, so she lifts her skirts to avoid getting them wet. Her legs are revealed, and she does not shave them. Modern feminist commentators have interpreted this attribute as a sign that power has made her unfeminine. This episode also appears in the Targum Sheni. "Your beauty is the beauty of women, but your hair is the hair of men," Solomon tells her. In Jewish literature, the Queen of Sheba is also identified with Lilith, an ancient demonic figure. Likewise, in the Quranic text, a jinn warned Suleiman about the queen's demonic side, fearing the king might be tempted by her beauty. Instead, the queen submits to Solomon and commits herself to Allah, the Lord of all worlds, the mother of a nation. In the 14th century, in the northern highlands of the Horn of Africa, present-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and Djibouti, the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba took on a new meaning. In this version of the tale, the queen has a name, Makeda. This new version melded a wealth of literary and Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions to create something new. Christianity became the religion of the Kingdom of Aksum in the mid-500s CE. It arrived, along with Jewish influences, by way of migration and trade with northern people, including the Coptic Christians of Egypt. The story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba emerged in writings in 1321 in the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of the Kings of Ethiopia. Attributed to Ishaq Nebura Eid, the work is divided into 117 chapters, described by Ethiopian scholar Edward Ollendorff as a gigantic conflation of legendary cycles. It would be the text that unified Ethiopian culture for centuries. The Kebra Nagast cites references to the Queen of Sheba in the New Testament, notably the Gospel of Matthew. The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here. The epic goes on to relate how a wealthy merchant called Tamrin returns to Ethiopia, having met King Solomon in Jerusalem. Tamrin tells Queen Makeda in great detail of Solomon's prodigious wisdom and wealth. Intrigued by the merchant's tale, Makeda travels to Jerusalem to meet the king herself. There, she discovers how perfect he was in composure, and wise in understanding, and pleasant in graciousness, and commanding in stature. In turn, Solomon is captivated by Makeda's beauty, and tries to make her stay. He serves her a sumptuous banquet, and swears not to make advances on her, as long as she takes nothing from his house. When a thirsty Makeda wakes in the night and drinks some water, Solomon declares the oath broken and seduces her. Makeda returns to Ethiopia, pregnant with Solomon's child, a boy she names Menelik, meaning son of the wise. At age 20, he travels to Jerusalem to meet his father, who anoints him king of Ethiopia. This origin story became the foundation for the ruling Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia, which was founded around 1270 and ruled for more than 7 centuries. The author of the Kebra Nagast, according to Ollendorff, was the redactor and interpreter of material, which had long been known but had not until then found a coordinating hand, an expository mind, and a great national need. The result, he added, is one of the most powerful and influential national sagas anywhere in the world. The Kebra Nagast offers a more positive portrayal of the queen than in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim texts. No mention is made of her demonic nature or hairy legs. The epic also claims that Menelik returned to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian tradition claims is stored in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum. Searching for Sheba. The realm of Sheba remains lost to history. The 2 leading locations are the Kingdom of Saba in modern Yemen and the ancient Kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. After more than a century of excavations by a host of archaeologists to find physical evidence of the existence of the queen, none has yet been found. One of the complicating factors is that the chronology attributed to Solomon which most place around the 10th century BCE, does not line up with the prime of either Saba or Aksum. Most Jewish sources and the Quran mention sites that clearly associate Sheba with Saba. The ancient city's existence is amply supported by evidence. Assyrian texts speak about Arabian queens from the period of Saba's greatness. The Sabaeans also sent ambassadors and gifts to the Assyrian court on diplomatic and commercial missions. The kingdom grew rich off successful water management and trade in frankincense and myrrh, but it emerged as an international power only in the 8th century BCE, long after Solomon's reign. Although the Book of Kings was written in the 6th century BCE, after the decline of Assyria, the Solomon story may represent an older story that reflects the geopolitical realities of the centuries before. With this in mind, the biblical archaeologist Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University interprets the Solomon and Queen of Sheba story as support for Judah's participation in Assyrian trade against those who viewed it as a rash undertaking that would lead to idolatry. By inflating Solomon's status as a great merchant blessed by God who was sought out by a powerful Arabian queen in the 10th century, the story's authors wanted to legitimize the participation of Judah as a vassal in the Assyrian economy. The Ethiopian theory has strong support in the form of 1st century CE historian Flavius Josephus. He described Solomon's guest as the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia, which suggests an African origin. Historical links have been established between Ethiopia and Saba. The two kingdoms are just across the Red Sea from each other. In ancient times, southern Arabian traders, including those from Saba, made the short trip across the Red Sea to set up small settlements in the Ethiopian highlands. Intriguing though this association is, it does not resolve the chronology problem. Aksum was a flourishing Ethiopian kingdom from 100 BCE to 700 CE, many years after Solomon's reign. New scholarship about the queen and her origins are still emerging. Wendy Laura Belcher, professor of African literature at Princeton University, proposed that the queen might be from another culture entirely, the pre-Aksumite Ethiopian culture of Punt. Mentioned in Egyptian sources as early as the 15th century BCE, Punt provided Egypt with incense, spices, and gold, all commodities associated with the queen and her visit with Solomon. Historians are divided as to the exact location of Punt, but generally place it southeast of Egypt and north of the Horn of Africa. Finds of Egyptian goods in northern Ethiopia confirm the long-standing trade relationship between them, which would have provided Punt with considerable wealth, enough to attract the attention of a king like Solomon. As Belcher wrote, if any queen was going to travel north to Israel in the 10th century, it would have been an African queen. Let's see a little bit more about Saba. On to the next article, the Plague of Athens, which I had never ever heard of. I learned so much in this article. Let me know what you guys think. Two of the most powerful city-states in ancient Greece, Sparta and Athens, went to war in 431 BCE. Tensions between the two had been simmering for decades before boiling over into war. Occupying the lands of the Peloponnese, Sparta enacted a land-based strategy, relying on their disciplined hoplites to defeat the Athenians in the open field. When Spartan troops would invade Attica, the peninsula where Athens and its allies are located, Athenians responded with naval attacks on politically sensitive points in the Peloponnese. rural populations in Attica would be forced to take refuge within Athens' city walls when Sparta invaded. The Peloponnesian War would end by fundamentally shifting power in the Mediterranean, but neither Athens' navy nor Sparta's soldiers could claim to be the determining factor of the conflict. That honor belongs to an event that nobody could have predicted or planned for, the Plague of Athens, which broke out in the war's second year. A medical mystery to this day, this ancient epidemic would be the most influential factor to shape the war and decide which city-state would be the final victor. Look at the Parthenon. Gorgeous. Outbreak. In spring 430 BCE, locals in Piraeus, the port area of Athens, began to fall ill with a disease no one had seen before. The malady spread quickly. Reports circulated of similar outbreaks on the island of Lemnos in the North Aegean and other locations. In Piraeus, rumors spread that when the Spartans had arrived, they had poisoned the wells there, so that Athenians were sickened by drinking contaminated water. In a matter of weeks, the disease had spread to the heart of the city and was affecting people of all ages and backgrounds and in unprecedented proportions. The strategy of the Athenian leader Pericles to bring people from rural Attica into the walled city of Athens only increased the rate of contagion. The illness, whatever it was, did not affect the Spartans to the same degree as the Athenians. In total, it is estimated that between 25 and 35% of the population of Athens would perish as a result of the plague when it ended 5 years later. The main source of information about the epidemic comes from the historian Thucydides, who not only witnessed the events firsthand, but survived the disease himself. In the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides believes the plague originated in eastern Africa, in the lands of ancient Ethiopia, present-day Sudan. From there, the sickness traveled north to Egypt and Libya, and east to the Persian Empire before reaching Greece. Early in his account, Thucydides writes, "I shall give a statement of what it was like, which people can study in case it should ever attack again." His descriptions chart how the disease progressed in its victims. From the first symptoms, people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat or tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. Symptoms included sneezing and hoarseness before the disease attacked the chest, causing a hard cough, and in the stomach, where it triggered discharges of bile, ineffectual retching, and violent spasms. By this point, the victim was in very great distress. Thucydides describes the appearance of the patient's skin, reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. Sufferers described intense fevers, feeling as though a fire was consuming them inside, so they would remove all their clothes. They experienced an unquenchable thirst, which led some to plunge themselves into water tanks as well. Extreme insomnia followed. Treating the sick. Thucydides reports that many patients died within 7 to 9 days of being infected. If they made it through the first stage, they might then suffer severe ulceration of the bowels accompanied by diarrhea. The ensuing weakness generally proved fatal. The main problems in treating the disease was its novelty and its contagiousness. Doctors had never experienced anything quite like it, leaving their expertise powerless against the epidemic. No remedy was found that could be used as a specific, writes Thucydides. For what did good in one case did harm in another. Regardless of the treatment given, he writes, strong and weak constitutions proved equally incapable of resistance, all alike being swept away. The contagious disease took a toll on those who cared for the sick. Physicians were badly hit early on. Indeed, anyone who nursed their sick loved ones paid a high price. If they ventured to do so, death was the consequence. If they did not, the patients perished from neglect. Indeed, many houses were emptied of their inmates for want of a nurse. Thucydides notes that it was with those who had recovered from the disease that the sick and the dying found most compassion. These knew what it was from experience. Infection seems to have brought with it some immunity. The same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. Those who had been infected but had come through might experience a brief euphoric feeling that they could survive anything. Even so, the plague, whatever it was, could leave those who recovered with severe after effects. Some people were seized with an entire loss of memory on their first recovery and did not know either themselves or their friends. Many survivors suffered lasting damage to their fingers and toes, genitals, and eyes. As well as its impact on health, the epidemic caused radical disruption to everyday life for Athenians. According to Thucydides, the bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets. Corpses piled up, and given the urgency of the situation, there was no time to perform even the most elementary rites when burying the dead. Several bodies would be cremated at the same time on the same pyre. Civil unrest. The plague had a radical effect on Athenian society. Traditional hierarchies were turned upside down. Wealthy citizens might see their livelihoods destroyed from one day to the next, while poor ones might get rich by appropriating a dead man's assets. Thucydides describes how moral conventions were abandoned and people tended to live each day as if it were their last. As the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. Nobody feared justice, as death by plague seemed more imminent than any pending court case. Spiritual concerns loomed large as well. Many believed something had angered the gods who unleashed the disease as punishment. According to Thucydides, the elders spoke of an ancient oracle that had predicted a great epidemic would ensue after a Dorian war. The Spartans were Dorians, descendants of an ancient people who had settled in the Peloponnese. It was also rumored that the Spartans had consulted the oracle at Delphi about the outcome of the war. Through prophecy, the god Apollo had promised his support to Sparta. The Athenians themselves sought counsel of the gods and sent emissaries to Delphi and other sanctuaries for divine guidance on the epidemic. Overwhelmed by the impact of the plague on their loved ones and on their way of life, Athenians began to turn against their leader Pericles. While the move may have seemed practical at the time, with hindsight, his war strategy of encouraging the population to shelter from Sparta's attacks within Athens' city walls had worsened the sanitary conditions in the city. As Thucydides records, an aggravation of the existing calamity was the influx from the country into the city, and this was especially felt by the new arrivals. As there were no houses to receive them, they had to be lodged at the hot season of the year in stifling cabins, where the mortality raged without restraint. Pericles' political rivals went further, accusing him of calling down the misfortune upon them through his determined support for the war. After more than a decade of often adoring support, Athens turned against Pericles. A heavy fine was levied against him, and he was not re-elected as official strategist. Having been thrown out of office for mishandling the epidemic, Pericles would then suffer the ravages of the disease firsthand. According to the historian Plutarch, Pericles' eldest son, Xanthippus, who had a rocky relationship with his father, succumbed to the plague, as did Pericles' sister shortly after. His second son, Perillus, also fell ill and died, a tragedy that ended up breaking the legendary self-control of Pericles, who died from the plague himself in fall 249 BCE. The epidemic greatly weakened Athens and brought an end to its golden age. By the time the plague ended around 425 BCE, it is estimated that nearly a third of the city's people died, with between 75,000 to 100,000 lives lost. Sparta and Athens would strike a truce around 421 BCE. Sparta would ultimately win the Peloponnesian War, destroying the Athenian fleet at sea in 405. Mystery malady. Historians have still not identified the epidemic's exact source. Because of Thucydides' use of the word plague, some have hypothesized that it was an outbreak of the bubonic plague, cause of the Black Death in the 14th century. However, close reading of Thucydides shows no mention of the Black Death's most notorious symptoms, the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that blackened and sometimes burst. Over time, scholars have proposed several culprits, bacterial and viral, including typhus, cholera, influenza, smallpox, and measles. As research tools have become more sophisticated, new theories have emerged. In 1994, a mass grave dating to 430 to 420 BCE was identified. Within it were 150 bodies that appeared to have been hastily buried. A team of researchers led by Manoulis J. Papagrigorakis analyzed DNA from the dental pulp of 3 individuals. Publishing their results in 2006, they found the presence of a pathogen with a 93% similarity to typhoid fever. Other scholars, however, have challenged the theory that the plague was caused by the illness because typhoid was common at the time. Thucydides' account is of an ailment the likes of which had never been seen before in ancient Greece, a so-called virgin soil epidemic. Many of Thucydides' symptoms match those of Ebola. Unlike illnesses of bacterial origin like typhoid or bubonic plague, finding genetic evidence of viruses like Ebola or measles is more challenging. To identify them, geneticists must study RNA, which is more unstable than DNA and degrades more easily over time. Finding a viable sample from 5th century BCE Athens is very unlikely, so if the plague of Athens was caused by a virus, its precise identity will remain a mystery for now. Moving on to the warriors of Xi'an. The land belonging to farmer Yang Jifa in eastern China was covered by fruitful orchards of persimmon and pomegranate trees. In 1974, while digging a well, his spade struck something unexpected in the soil, a man's head. On closer inspection, Yang saw that the object was clay, not bone. He alerted the local authorities, and over the months that followed, Chinese archaeologists made an astonishing discovery. Under Yang's peaceful orchards lay a man-made army thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers and hundreds of sculpted horses, along with bronze carriages and weapons. The figures were unearthed less than a mile to the east of the 3rd century BCE resting place of Qin Shi Huangdi, China's first emperor and one of the most important figures in its history. Today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that attracts millions of visitors every year. The complex, including not only the vast terracotta army but also the tombs of real people, is regarded as the biggest funerary complex in the world, extending more than 25 square miles. 4 pits have so far been excavated. The first pit, by far the biggest, contains the infantry. The second pit contains archers, chariots, infantry, and cavalry, and perhaps represents an encampment. The third pit, much smaller, contains high-ranking officials, and the fourth one is empty. Some think the emperor died before its contents were completed. More than 2,000 warriors have been recovered to date, but that's just a fraction of the army. The total number is believed to be around 8,000, and archaeologists suspect more pits still lie undiscovered. Once painted in vivid colors, the figures represent numerous military occupations and ranks, and display a variety of different facial features and costumes. The vast resources and manual labor required to manufacture them 2,200 years ago has made them a global icon of the military and artistic achievement of the Qin dynasty. Unity and tyranny. The future emperor was born Zhao Jing in 259 BCE. At age 13, he became king of the province of Qin. By 221 BCE, he had conquered several other provinces and proclaimed himself Qin Shi Huangdi, or the first August emperor of Qin. His short reign was marked by major advances in centralizing power as well as acts of tyranny. He standardized writing, weights and measures, and monetary and legal systems. During his reign, building the Great Wall began. The first emperor also won notoriety for burning books and persecuting intellectuals. Which you can see here. Look at this. They're throwing them into a pit. Burning their books. Oh boy. Look at this face. He means business. The enormous mausoleum he built for himself near Qian speaks of the resources at his disposal. Sources say Qin Shi Huangdi employed hundreds of thousands to build the complex and its contents. He also altered the landscape for his funerary complex. Courses of rivers had to be altered. Digging the pits for the figures would have required an army of laborers to carry away the displaced soil. The production of the figurines is a marvel of both logistics and artistry. Many warriors stand as tall as 6 feet and weigh about 450 pounds. Their beauty becomes more impressive up close, revealing the details of their hairstyles, their facial features, the realistic folds in their clothing, and the remnants of the pigments once used in their coloring. You can kind of see here. Scholars have long debated as to the methods behind their creation and have done hands-on experiments to try to reverse engineer the process. The feat is even more impressive in the context of Qin Shi Huangdi's reign, even assuming that he had ordered its construction before unifying China and proclaiming himself emperor in 221 BCE. There were only a few years to complete the work before his death in 210 BCE. During his reign, China was a mosaic of cultures, ethnicities, and religions. The idea of a centralized and authoritarian political power giving orders from a remote capital through civil servants was still alien and highly difficult to communicate and implement. Seeking immortality. The first emperor regarded himself as the ruler of an immense territory and a monarch who unified the world of the spirits. The written sources explain that Qin Shi Huangdi sought potions to extend his life and dispatched envoys to look for such elixirs. His great tomb is a testament to the quest of immortality, in that this great monument would remind future generations of his greatness. Archaeologists have yet to excavate the emperor's burial mound itself. To create it, workers excavated to a depth of 100 feet, then constructed a sepulchre before covering it with a pyramid-shaped mound standing more than 165 feet high. Much speculation surrounds what might be inside. China's 2nd century BC historian Sima Qian recorded that the emperor's remains might be protected by rivers of mercury and traps to stop intruders. Both the mausoleum's design and the materials used reveal the intention of surrounding himself with what he needed in the afterlife. Its construction was intended to reinforce his power when alive, an extraordinary display of the supremacy of a new sovereign capable of mobilizing all the materials, workers, and knowledge needed to create something on an unparalleled scale and splendor. News about this ostentatious project probably resonated all the way to the outer limits of Qin China. It contributed to the mystic aura of an emperor so rich and powerful he could create a life-size model army, drawn up and ready for all eternity, facing east toward the territories that he had so spectacularly conquered. Look at this. All the soldiers. It's so remarkable. And to think this was just under some guy's orchard. I liked reading this because look at all the different faces that there are. They're all different. So interesting. Oh, and a chariot. Or, I think so. But this is the real story about chariots. The need for speed. This one I was looking forward to the least because I thought I knew a lot about chariot racing, but I was so wrong. This is so interesting, guys. Here we go. Thundering hooves, spinning wheels, a cheering crowd. Envisioning an ancient Roman chariot race is easy, but many 21st century notions of the sport come from the writings of the 19th. Adapted several times for the big screen, the 1959 film is perhaps the best known. The 1880 novel Ben-Hur climaxes with a thrilling chariot race. American author Lew Wallace meticulously researched classic texts to make his book as authentic as possible, but his passion for chariot racing comes shining through. Can we accept the saying, "Then these latter days, so tame in pastime and dull in sports, have scarcely anything to compare to the spectacle"? Let the reader try to fancy it. Let him first look down upon the arena and see it glistening. Let him then, in this perfect field, see the chariots, light of wheel, very graceful and ornate. Let him see the drivers in their right hands' goads, in their left hands held in careful separation, and high the reins. Let him see the fours, chosen for beauty as well as speed. Wallace adored chariot racing, but ancient Rome's relationship to it was more complicated. The spectacle, as described by Wallace centuries later, was indeed intoxicating, but some Roman elites looked upon racing with disapproval. These same elites funded the construction of massive venues for racing, such as the Circus Maximus in Rome and the Hippodrome in Constantinople. Chariot racing's popularity only grew as the Roman Empire expanded. New stadiums were built in other cities, and racing became an obsession there. Games for the gods. In the 1st century BCE, the poet Ovid, famous in his time for writing scandalous verse, used the race course as an arena for passion as well as sport. Book 3 of Ovid's Amores describes an incident at the races where a young woman is waiting for the race to start. The narrator explains to her his motive for being there. You are looking at the race, I'm looking at you. We'll both see what delights us, and both feast our eyes. Ovid's verse, set in Rome's Circus Maximus, compares the passions excited by racing with those aroused by the opposite sex. In Ovid's time, competitive charioteering was popular and profane. Chariot racing's historic roots, however, tap deep into the sacred beliefs of ancient Greece, whose games, such as the Olympic and the Pythian events, were not considered entertainment. They were holy activities and part of solemn religious rites. The purpose of these events, which included chariot racing, was to please the gods, either through sacrifice or in presenting bodily skill as an offering in itself. Homer's epic, the Iliad, features chariot races as part of the funeral games ordered by the mourning Achilles in honor of his fallen companion Patroclus. The word hippodrome also comes from the Greek, with hippo meaning horses and dromos meaning path. Games likewise formed an important religious role in the emerging power of Rome. Chariot racing was incorporated into the early Ludi Romani, the games held in honor of the chief Roman god Jupiter Optimus Maximus. In 366 BCE, the Ludi Romani became an annual event, sponsored by the state. As Rome's military influence grew, generals began dedicating portions of their war booty to sponsor chariot races and other games. Arguably, it is at this stage that the spirit of chariot racing began to evolve into entertainment. Sponsorship by generals boosted the popularity of racing and other sports, so by the 1st century BCE, the games were associated with mass culture, power, and populism. By the mid-1st century BCE, racing had become a major Roman spectacle. Julius Caesar commissioned a magnificent new hippodrome, the Circus Maximus, in the valley below Rome's Palatine Hill, an area that had long been used to stage horse races. Built around 50 BCE, this venue featured a track measuring about 1,700 by 260 feet, 12 starting gates, called carceres for chariots, a decorated barrier, the spina, dividing the track, turning posts or metae at each end, and lap markers in the shape of eggs and dolphins. Each marker would be turned when a section of the race was completed. Caesar's circus could seat as many as 150,000 spectators, but when the venue was later expanded by Rome's emperors, it could hold as many as 250,000. Team colors. Chariot racing was not the only athletic entertainment in ancient Rome. The venationes, or killing of wild animals, gladiatorial fights, and mock naval battles were all popular attractions for both the skill of the participants and the spectacle of the events. What seemed to set chariot racing apart from those other attractions was a strong sense of loyalty to a favorite team of charioteers. Much like sports leagues today, Roman chariot racing had teams with legions of devoted fans. The four factions, red, Rusata, white, Albata, blue, Venata, and green, Prasina, existed during the Republic and continued well into the Empire. 3rd century CE writer Tertullian recorded that the rivalry between whites and reds was the oldest. Their supporters would reinforce the sense of enmity between the two by associating white with winter and red with summer. Teams could also be associated with divinities, white with the wind god Zephyr, and red with the war god Mars. Roman chariot races were thrilling and short, but occasionally brutal. The race would begin with the dropping of a white handkerchief or mappa. In a standard race at the Circus Maximus, each team could enter 3 chariots. So when the mappa fell to the ground, a total of 12 horse-drawn vehicles might shoot out from the traps or carceries in clouds of dust. There were variations in the equine makeup of a chariot team. Some featured as many as 7 horses, some as few as 2. The baiga, the quadriga, composed of 4 horses, was the most common configuration. The orge, or drivers, would careen on their 2-wheeled chariots to make the death-defying turn around the ends of the spina. The usual course was 7 laps, run counterclockwise around the arena. Races lasted anywhere between 10 and 12 minutes. As many as 24 races could be run in a day, to the delight of fans. Their devotion to their team could even lead to cheating. There were accounts of spectators trying to sabotage the race by throwing tablets studded with nails onto the track. Drivers and horses. Charioteers and even their horses became superstars with devoted, loyal followings. Perhaps the best known and wealthiest of his time was Scorpus, who drove for the Green faction in the 1st century CE. Sources say he won more than 2,000 races before his death at age 27, most likely in one of the spectacular pileups that the Romans called naufragia, which means shipwrecks. A former slave, Scorpus purchased his freedom with his earnings. When Scorpus died, the Roman poet Martial penned his eulogy. "Oh, sad misfortune, that you, Scorpus, should be cut off in the flower of your youth, and be called so prematurely to harness the dusky steeds of Pluto. The chariot race was always shortened by your rapid driving, but oh, why should your own race have been so speedily run?" It's really poetic. Pliny the Elder documented the deep grief felt by fans at the deaths of their favorite drivers. In his Natural History, Pliny wrote how, at the funeral of Felix the charioteer of the Reds, one of his backers threw himself upon the pyre. A pitiful story. Horses also gained fame and adoration. In addition to celebrating Scorpus, Martial maybe, mentions the horses. "I am that marshal known to all nations and people. I am not better known than the horse Andraemon." Dedicated fans would know each horse's lineage. The most successful would be honorably retired when the moment came, so that they could live on their last years in peace and procreate to continue their pedigree. Some even had funerary monuments dedicated to them, such as that raised to Spendusa. Fast as the wind, incomparable in your life, you now dwell in the realm of Lethe. Bread and circuses. A great deal of money and power was at stake in chariot racing. Senior public figures pumped money into the games in the hope it would increase their political standing. A central figure in the booming business aspect of the races by the 1st century CE was the Dominus Factionum, the entrepreneur in charge of the faction. Ooh, the Circus Maximus. The huge sums of money could spark bitter state-level disputes. In the early 1st century, a high-ranking official was accused of trying to delay payment of the cash prizes, which could range between 15,000 and 60,000 sesterces. His name was Gnaeus Domitius Abrinobarbius, whose son, Emperor Nero, would develop a singular passion for chariot racing and actually participate in races. On one occasion, Nero himself tried to pilot a chariot pulled by 10 horses. This was too much for him to handle. He was thrown and severely injured, but managed to survive. For all its popularity, chariot racing did have its critics. Long before Christian polemicists like Tertullian singled out the immortality of the racecourse, pre-Christian Romans expressed discomfort with the games in general. In a letter written in the early 2nd century, Pliny the Younger writes of the fans at chariot races. There might be some reason for their enthusiasm if it was the speed of the horses or the skill of the drivers that was the attraction, but it is the racing colors which they favor. Such is the influence and authority vested in one cheap tunic. For all the distaste they felt, influential Romans also knew that the races and games in general were interwoven into Roman state power. On taking the office of aedile in 69 BCE, the orator Cicero had to swear to uphold the games for the people of Rome. Later in his treatise on moral duties, however, he argued that the practice whereby rich rulers buy public favor through lavish entertainment is imprudent, gratifying to boys and weak women and slaves, and to free men who bear the nearest resemblance to slaves. The idea that the races and games were a tool for social control was most memorably expressed by the early 2nd century author Juvenal. In one of his satires, he writes about how easy it was for politicians to buy influence with voters who anxiously hope for just 2 things, bread and circuses. Christianity and chariots. There's a sideshow going on in the distance. Can you hear it? Very distinct Bay Area aspect here. Anyway, as the Roman Empire grew larger, chariot racing expanded throughout its provinces. Hippodromes were built in the major urban centers across the empire, including Antioch and Constantinople in Turkey, Caesarea in Israel, Alexandria and Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, Thuga in Tunisia, Toledo and Cordoba in Spain, Lyon in France, and Vienna in Austria. As part of his Romanizing program, the client king of Judea, Herod the Great, had instituted chariot racing as part of formal games in 28 BCE. Sources record a hippodrome built in Jerusalem some time after, but its location has not yet been identified. By the 4th century, the factional system of color-based racing teams was firmly established, especially in Constantinople, which had become the capital city of the Roman Empire in 330 CE. Constantine the Great rebuilt the city's hippodrome and expanded its capacity to seat as many as 100,000 people. The Circus Maximus was still bigger, but the Hippodrome became the center of life in the new Roman capital. The reds and the whites would eventually disappear, but the blues and the greens grew stronger and emerged as the leading factions. Also by the 4th century, a tradition had established itself linking certain charioteers with sorcery. Historian Ammianus Marcellinus recounts the execution of a 4th century charioteer in Rome for his crime, perhaps reflecting the widespread belief that charioteers lived beyond the bounds of respectable society. Chariot racing was both fantastically popular and morally suspect, negative associations that also fed into the growing Christian antipathy to the sport. Saint John Chrysostom became Archbishop of Constantinople in 398 CE, fewer than 20 years after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its state religion. In a fiery homily, the furious archbishop reported that Christian believers had left the fold, deserting us for the spectacle of horse racing. He ended with an ultimatum. Anyone attending the races would be excommunicated. His warnings were in vain. By the 5th century, chariot racing in Constantinople underwent an evolution. As Christianity stabilized, the controversies of the new state faith were absorbed into the local charioteering rivalries. Historians differ on the extent to which Christianity drove the intense hostility between the blue and the greens in Constantinople. As a general rule, the blues were associated with the establishment and Orthodox Christian beliefs, while the greens styled themselves as closer to the people. It was in this setting that the so-called Nika riots engulfed Constantinople. Factional tension was intensified by the Emperor Justinian I's allegiance to the blues and the fact that his wife Theodora belonged to a family of circus performers, formerly greens, who had switched their allegiance to the blues. Tension over taxation attached itself to the green-blue enmity, and in 532, Justinian had people from both factions killed. Greens and blues found common cause, and they turned their exhortatory hippodrome cry of Nika, Nika, win, win, against the emperor himself. As disorder spread, Theodora boldly took the initiative and sent the mercenaries to slaughter greens and blues indiscriminately. The Nika riots left as many as 30,000 dead and effectively broke the power of the factions. Amid religious tensions and civil war in the Byzantine Empire, the appetite for racing started to decline at the end of the 6th century. In Rome, the last official race was held at the Circus Maximus in 549, in a city then under control of the Ostrogoths. Charioteering had run a long race, but the experiences of Rome's racing fans are a foundation for the potent mix of camaraderie and tension experienced in stadiums all over the world today. I think I like that one because it reminds me so much of modern sports. The Queen's Corsair, Sir Francis Drake. I'd always wondered about him because I know he sailed here where I am in San Francisco, and I have a map here of California. Can you see? That's Monterey. There's the bay. Okay, so there we go. So up here is a long road called Sir Francis Drake Drive, and I have some friends who lived near here. They went to Sir Francis Drake High School. So, but that was like pretty much all I really knew about Sir Francis Drake. So this was really fun to read. Anyway, here we go. Oh, and then his ship, of course. layers. That's the most famous thing about him, like it says here at the start. Every British schoolchild knows that Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe on the Golden Hind. Fewer are aware that when he set out on the voyage in 1577, the ship was called the Pelican, and that Drake changed the name mid-voyage to manage the consequences of having beheaded one of his own officers following a rushed and some would say unsafe trial. 4 centuries of myth-making have created different versions of Drake. To the English, he was a plucky hero of the Elizabethan Golden Age who outsmarted the mighty Spanish. To the Spanish, he was a pirate, feared and hated as El Draca, the dragon. El Drake? Drac? El Drac. El Drac. Historians have peeled away these layers to reveal a more nuanced portrait. Drake lived just as England was beginning to carve out a new naval role for itself on the European and global stage. A brilliant and fearless navigator in a new age of colonialism, Drake used and was used by England's elite to get rich through pillage and slave trading. Tales of adventure. In the popular imagination, Drake is associated with one monarch, Elizabeth I. Drake's youth, however, was deeply shaped by the religious tumult brought on during the reigns of her predecessors. Born in 1540, late in the reign of Henry VIII, Drake was a child under the Protestant Edward VI and then the Catholic Queen Mary I. Drake's early years were spent on a farm in Devon in western England. After his father, a sheep shearer, became a Protestant curate in southeast England, Drake was sent to live with relatives, the Hawkins family in Plymouth. The Hawkinses, as sailors and traders, exploited the growing transatlantic trade. Drake's life would be dominated by Plymouth, the port that would play a key role in England's colonialism, and from where the Pilgrims would set off in 1620. John Hawkins, Drake's older cousin, became a close friend and mentor. Around age 18, Drake began sailing on the Hawkinses' boats and was already gaining experience at sea in acts of piracy against French vessels. Requiring skill, bravery, ruthlessness, and a streak of cruelty, it was a job at which Drake would excel all his life. Drake, Hawkins, and other privateers were tacitly permitted to prey on French shipping because England was at war with France. This war, of benefit to Spain, was a consequence of Queen Mary's decision to wed Spain's King Philip II in 1554. Simplified accounts of Drake often portray him as anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic. His early life, however, was marked by close links with Spain, then a global superpower. The Hawkins family business had grown in the context of Mary's alliance with Spain, and in the blurred area between merchant, privateer, and diplomat, John Hawkins forged links with Spanish merchants, with whom he carried out acts of piracy against the French. He may even have had some diplomatic role in helping broker Philip and Queen Mary's marriage, and despite being a Protestant, was said to have attended Catholic Mass. Profit and glory. In November 1558, Mary I died, and her half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, became Queen of England. In the early years of her reign, Elizabeth was careful not to antagonize Spain, but was aware of how the Americas were generating great wealth for Spain, increasing its naval power and spreading the Catholic faith. Colonial expansion intrigued the Queen, and little in the way of international law governed the course that expansion could take. At the time, Elizabeth I did not have the naval power to match Spain at sea, so she needed to find a different way to challenge the Spanish Empire. Similar operations proved to be a profitable strategy, but in the headlong race for wealth and glory, consideration for the lives of non-Europeans was absent. By 1562, with the help of fellow Spanish traders and the backing of a London syndicate, Hawkins broke into the lucrative transatlantic slave trade, seizing people in West Africa to sell in the Americas. Following the success of the first expedition, Elizabeth and members of her Privy Council invested in the next two trips, financially benefiting from the sale of people as chattel. Drake participated in all of Hawkins's ventures, including the operation to purchase and kidnap hundreds of people from local rulers in Sierra Leone. Despite their profits, Hawkins and Drake faced a problem. The Spanish crown prohibited trade between its colonies and other nations, even though colonists sought trade opportunities. Hawkins, and later Drake, developed a Baroque ritual. First, he requested a license to trade and would be rebuffed. Then he fired on the colonial settlements. In response, the Spanish put on a show of resistance. After a decent interval had elapsed, both sides worked behind the scenes to covertly buy and sell. In 1568, however, at the fort of San Juan de Ulua in the port of Veracruz, today in Mexico, this tactic failed. Drake was sailing under the command of his cousin Hawkins, who had docked in San Juan de Ulua to repair and restock his 6 ships with assurances that the Spanish would not attack. The Spanish reneged, sinking or capturing 4 of the English ships. Drake and Hawkins managed to escape to safety. Hawkins's ship, however, held many survivors, whom he was later forced to leave stranded. Drake, meanwhile, headed back alone to England, and so forsook us in our great misery, Hawkins wrote later. This incident placed a great strain on the two men's relationship. Drake, who lost goods and close friends in the attack, vowed to take revenge. Drake asserted that the incident left him with a deep hatred for both the Spanish and Catholicism. His seamanship would give him plenty of opportunities for revenge. England was not officially at war with Spain, so Drake could not yet receive a letter of marque from the Queen to attack enemy ships and populations. Even so, during a series of expeditions he conducted from 1570, backed by the Crown, Drake led increasingly daring raids into the Spanish Main. In Central America, Drake climbed a tall tree from which he could sight the Pacific and vowed that he would enter its waters aboard an English vessel. These early incursions into Spanish colonies included notable failures. From these, Drake learned the need for discipline and planning. Finally, in 1572, after a carefully organized raid on a treasure caravan in Nombre de Dios, today in Panama, he struck gold, or rather silver, in huge quantities. The haul allowed him to return to England with a fortune, as well as significant plunder in captured boats. The wealth and reputation of the young buccaneer had attracted the admiring attention of the Queen. Drake was now one of Elizabeth's sea dogs. A group of captains, including Hawkins, whose piracy provided a source of income for the Crown while disrupting Spain's colonial operations around the world. The England that Drake returned to in 1573 was enjoying a brief truce with Spain. For a few years he refrained from long-distance ventures, But in 1577, glory beckoned once more. He was appointed to command an expedition through the Strait of Magellan to the Pacific. Although the venture could not be publicly supported by the crown, Drake did have the Queen's personal backing. In their meeting, Elizabeth reportedly told him she would gladly be revenged on the King of Spain for diverse injuries that we have received. The objective of the venture was to find out places meet to have traffic. Since it was not envisaged that the fleet would have anything to trade, the Queen was guardedly saying the voyage would enrich itself and its financial backers through piracy. Crewed by about 170 men, the 5-ship fleet set out from England in the dying days of 1577. Initially, the crew were told they were going to the eastern Mediterranean, yikes, but evidence for another plan must have become clear from early in the voyage. It's a nice way of saying it. Led by Drake's own ship, the Pelican, the fleet followed roughly the same route of the Portuguese sailor Ferdinand Magellan, who nearly 60 years before had captained the first circumnavigation of the globe. A Venetian nobleman, Antonio Pigafetta, chronicled the voyage, and Drake's crew studied Pigafetta's account. The honor to chronicle Drake's journey fell to the ship's on-board rector, Francis Fletcher. The Atlantic crossing was rough on Drake's crew, leading to problems with morale. Back in 1520, Magellan had quarreled with his senior officer and bloodily put down a revolt in San Julian, in what is today southern Argentina. By coincidence, the same windswept port was the setting of Drake's settling the scores with his senior officer Thomas Doughty. Tensions between the noble Doughty and the lower-class Drake came to a head in July 1578, when Drake accused him of treason and witchcraft. Claiming his authority was based on a royal commission, a lie but an effective one, Drake tried Doughty and condemned him to death. Fletcher recounted how the two men shared a final meal together, as cheerfully as ever in their lives they had done aforetime. Shortly afterward, Doughty was beheaded. It had been argued that Drake's subsequent decision to rename the Pelican was to appease Doughty's close friend, Christopher Hatton, an influential investor of the expedition whose crest was a golden deer, or hind. The newly christened Golden Hind led a much smaller fleet, by then reduced to 3 boats since damage had rendered others too unseaworthy to sail into the Strait of Magellan. The stormy passage sank one boat and caused another to return to England after being separated from the group. In fall 1578, after 16 chaotic days, the Golden Hind and Drake sailed into the Pacific. Entirely alone, the Golden Hind sailed up the western coast of South America, past what is today Chile and Peru. The account of the voyage, based on Fletcher's chronicle published in 1628 as The World Encompassed, reflects not only the loneliness of the voyage, but also Drake's astonishing seamanship in maintaining and steering his ship, feeding and placating his crew, all the time directing his firepower on Spanish settlements and vessels who found themselves at the sharp end of English piracy for the first time. One of his biggest prizes was the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. The bounty aboard this Spanish treasure ship was so massive it took days to transfer it to Drake's coffers. Pushing far to the north, Drake made a bold bid to find the Northwest Passage that navigators believed would allow a route back to Europe. he may have traveled as far north as modern-day Vancouver. Forced south again by the cold, he anchored near what is now San Francisco. The Spanish would not establish a mission there until 1776. Drake claimed the lands around the spot for the Queen, naming them New Albion. Resuming his great voyage westward, the Golden Hind roughly followed Magellan's return route through the Spice Islands, then across the Indian Ocean to round the Cape of Good Hope. His return to Plymouth on September 26, 1580, filled the English with national pride and the coffers of his powerful investors with Spanish loot. His knighthood followed in April 1581 on the decks of the Golden Hind. Chaos in the Caribbean. After the circumnavigation, Drake spent the next few years dabbling in local politics in England. He served as mayor of Plymouth and purchased nearby Buckland Abbey as a fitting abode for a now wealthy man. Despite all this comfort, Drake could not stay away from the sea, and it is unlikely that Queen Elizabeth would have let her pirate, as she allegedly called him, stay ashore for long. Tensions were reaching a breaking point with Spain. Philip's support for Elizabeth's enemies in Ireland and Scotland, together with Elizabeth's support for insurgents in the Spanish Netherlands, was moving the two countries closer to war. In 1585, the Queen called upon Drake. He was chosen to command a fleet to target Spain's Caribbean holdings in what became known as his Great Expedition. Setting sail on September 14th, 1585, Drake's 29-ship fleet, crewed by 2,300 armed men, surged south to Spain itself. Historians believe Drake may have been hoping to ambush the Spanish treasure fleet near the southern tip of Portugal, but no sighting was made. After a failed attack on the Canary Islands, the fleet headed south for the Cape Verde archipelago off the coast of Senegal, where the corsairs spent 2 weeks looting the few riches the island had and hoarding food. They also picked up an epidemic, possibly pneumonic plague, on the island, which devastated the ship's crews. As Drake's fleet headed west toward the Caribbean, nearly 300 crew members died. Drake's first objective was Santo Domingo, today the capital of the Dominican Republic. By early January 1586, his forces had taken the city, but the looting did not produce the goods they'd hoped for, so the English demanded a ransom to leave. Having finally secured an acceptable fee, Drake's fleet moved on to Cartagena de Indias, today in Colombia, to repeat the tactic. After looting homes and richly adorned churches, they demanded a ransom from the local authorities. Drake was under pressure to complete the negotiations quickly, as the epidemic was still spreading among his men. Conditions aboard his ships were worsened by taking prisoner large numbers of enslaved people. In April, the fleet set sail again, but the ravages of the pestilence forced Drake to abandon plans to attack Cuba. In early June, he landed in Florida, where his men looted the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine. Having rested and taken on supplies, the fleet swept northward to the English colony of Roanoke Island in today's North Carolina, United States. When Drake arrived, he learned that the Roanoke colonists wanted to abandon the struggling settlement to return to England. The colonists accompanied Drake's fleet on its return leg across the Atlantic, bringing with them that Indian plant, a chronicler wrote, which they call tobacco and nicotia. Some historians believe Drake took the enslaved people from Cartagena to Roanoke Island, but it is not known if they stayed there or were taken to England. What befell them has never been established. established. Drake's missions had proven both that Spain's colonies were poorly defended and that England could significantly damage its enemy's imperial prestige through small, targeted attacks. Even though the great expedition turned out to be a financial flop, netting a fraction of what its investors hoped for, Drake's star continued to rise, especially in the context of England's defeat of the Spanish Armada. Spain was set on invading England with its impressive naval forces, about 130 ships, but in 1587 Drake had staged a daring raid, singeing the King of Spain's beard, as he described it, on the Spanish port of Cadiz. Drake's forces destroyed Spanish ships and supplies, delaying Philip II's assault against Elizabeth I until 1588. When the Spanish Armada eventually sailed north, it was defeated by a combination of the English Navy and poor weather. Drake served as a vice admiral in the effort to defeat the Spanish and earned the love of his country for it. For generations, the story circulated that Drake was playing bowls at Plymouth when news of the Armada's sighting reached him. Unperturbed, he declared there was still time to win the game and then beat the Spaniards. This tale helped forge a popular belief that Drake's cool confidence helped secure the English victory. The myth of Drake. Drake's last years were not glorious ones. Rather than retire to Plymouth, he returned to his life at sea. In 1589, his punitive raids into Spain caused great loss of life on both sides. Several years later, in August 1595, he crossed the Atlantic with John Hawkins in a bid to rescue Hawkins's kidnapped son and harass the Spanish. Their efforts were unsuccessful, and Hawkins died in November 1595. Drake pressed on, but was turned back by Spanish forces in Panama. In January 1596, at age 55, he died of dysentery aboard his ship. Dressed in a full suit of armor, he was enclosed in a lead coffin and buried at sea off the coast of Panama. After his death, romantic myths arose around Drake's legacy in English culture. His baser material motives were overlooked in order to forge a dashing, unflappable hero. In Spanish history, meanwhile, Drake provided ample material for the portrayal of a villain. Lope de Vega's poem La Dragontea presents a vivid demonization of the English sailor, whereas Juan de Castellanos' El Discurso de Capitán Francisco Drake slyly compliments the pirate's skills and uses his devastating attacks on Caribbean ports to criticize Spain's King Philip II. Long after British and Spanish imperial forces waned, Drake's figure serves as a lightning rod for the intense debate over the ethical dimensions of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. The end. Let's see. I think there was... Hold on. Where was it? Oh, it's over here. A preview of the next issue, which this magazine comes out bi-monthly. So next we're going to have an article about the Aztecs, one about Ludwig II, who was a big weirdo, Karnak, Hannibal, and the Sister Soldiers of Vietnam, which I've never heard of. It happened in 40 CE, so that'll be interesting. So that was a lot of fun, and would be nice to do again, but maybe by the time the next issue comes out, I'll have a Patreon. I'm going to start a Patreon when I hit 2,000 subscribers, so if you haven't already and you're still awake, go ahead and subscribe. And yeah, reading articles might be a Patreon thing someday. We'll see. But so much for watching. If you managed to stay awake, congratulations. Leave a comment below if you did. And thank you again. Have a very, very good night. Good night. Good night.